Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, we'll be examining this week's NATO summit at The Hague, and we'll be asking, was it as strong on substance as it was on form? Plus, the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth describes last weekend's US strikes on Iranian nuclear sites as historically successful, but Iran's supreme leader says they achieved nothing. Which is it? Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin with analysis of this week's NATO summit at The Hague, which is widely seen as having been a success for the 32-member alliance. Well, the US President Donald Trump was on the ground in the Netherlands for less than 24 hours, and yet he returned to Washington having secured a significant policy change, one that he's pushed for since 2017, namely to get member states to commit to boosting defence and security spending to 5% of GDP by the year 2035. Well, the US President has previously accused NATO members of freeloading off Washington. Well, the Hague summit was short and seemingly far more amicable than in previous years. It even saw the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte refer to President Trump as a daddy.
They're not going to be fighting each other. They've had it. They've had a big fight, like two kids in a schoolyard. You know, they fight like hell. You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes, then it's easier to stop them.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language to
You have to use strong language. Every once in a while you have to use a certain word.
So that was the US President Donald Trump speaking alongside the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Meanwhile, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was quick to brush off the commitment to that boost in defense spending by NATO member states. Here's what he said.
As for the impact of this 5% ceiling, or rather the 5% target on our security, I don't think it will be significant. We know what goals we are pursuing, we don't hide them, and we openly declare them. They are absolutely legal from the point of view of any interpretations, principles of the UN Charter and international law. And we know what means we will always use to ensure these goals.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Dr. Stefanie Babst, who is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO, who joined us from Foch in Germany. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Always a pleasure speaking to you. Let me start by asking you this, Dr. Babst. Was this summit, this NATO summit at The Hague, a success in your view?
Well, according to what allies leaders, as well as the NATO Secretary General said, it was all a splashing success. A short and sweet 2.5 hours meeting. The success rate was probably related to whether Donald Trump felt comfortable and was happy, and recalling his press conference, I had the impression that he left The Hague quite satisfied. But that's just one part of the story. The other is that unfortunately the NATO summit didn't deliver any type of strategic footprint.
Okay, but what it did deliver is a pledge from NATO member states to boost their spending on defence and security. I mean, to a level that President Trump has been saying for almost a decade now, it really needs to be achieving. I mean, that's a success, isn't it?
Well, it depends. I mean, first of all, it's a declaration of intent. It's a non-binding commitment along the lines that we've seen 11 years ago at the NATO Wales summit, when the NATO allies made a very similar pledge, this time to 2%, and they vote to really invest into upgrading and bolstering their defense and deterrence posture. It took them 11 years, and some of those countries hardly made it to the 2% target. Now, as far as the 5% is concerned, as I said, it's a declaration of intent, and many countries will continue to struggle with fiscal issues, with domestic priorities. Countries like Spain, Croatia, Italy, many others, they hardly met the 2% target. So I'm not too convinced that this is really a strategic message that President Putin, our strategic adversary, took serious in a sense that it will prevent him from doing what he has been doing in the past 11 years. And I think that's unfortunately.
Indeed, we heard the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov reacting to that announcement, that memo, saying that the extra spending won't really make much of a difference. But I mean, obviously, the Russians would have said that whatever. And you know, one of the things that has changed perhaps in the last couple of months is that the Russian economy is starting to look quite weak. And they don't seem to be winning this war, do they?
Well, I think coming back just for a minute to the pledge of 5%, it's more or less self-evident to me that Europeans and Canadians need to invest into their military capabilities, into their manpower, into improving the technological base for military capabilities, to overcome the fragmentation of the European defense market. All this is on the political table of governments for the past years. So I would have very much liked to see these governments just doing this, just implementing what they keep on saying for the past years, and instead use the summit to focus really on the broader, vitally important strategic issues. And the issue really unanswered, untackled, so to speak, is how can we deter Russia? How can we actually make Russia understand that it will never get Ukraine? And so none of this was discussed. All the issues, the strategic issues, were brushed aside at the NATO summit in The Hague. Because the American delegation made very clear at the very beginning that they didn't want to talk about a long-term strategy towards Russia. They didn't want to talk about the next steps in terms of securing Ukraine's future. They didn't want to talk about enlargement. They didn't want to talk about China. Well, I mean, I'm not surprised that the Russian side looked at the summit and said, okay, I mean, here were allies, I mean, who paddled their own shoulders, saying this was one more time a historic success, but the implementation of their political intent will yet to be delivered.
One commentator described the summit at The Hague as being a, quote, carefully choreographed show of NATO unity. I mean, we can be skeptical about, you know, that unity and we can be skeptical about the substance of what was achieved. But isn't it much better that those member states show unity than show disunity? I mean, doesn't it send out a key message?
Well, that's very much, I guess, what former colleagues of mine in the NATO headquarters would say. It's all about showing off. It's all about leaving the impression or giving the impression that there is a particular sense of unity and political solidarity. But people who watch what's going on in Europe, people who listen to what European leaders say, people who listen to President Trump in the past 100 days, they know perfectly well that there is no such a thing as a full-fledged, strong, robust unity. We have a US president who has cast doubt whether he is really committed to NATO ever since he has moved back into the Oval Office. We have a US president who is not only attacking long-standing allies such as Canada and Denmark, threatening them to invade them or make them their 51st member country. We have not only a President Trump in the White House who has openly saying that he is really not buying into the idea of defending the rules-based order and instead is showing more than sympathies to the Russian president. And then we have European countries, such as Hungary, such as Slovakia, who, you know, ever since Russia attacked Ukraine, keep on saying, this is not, you know, our issue. We want to keep our wonderful relations to Russia. We want to keep our business relations. We have countries such as Turkey, who continue to playing a very ambivalent role towards Russia. So I can't really see the type of unity, I mean, that we keep on talking about. And I think it's, it looks to me as if there is an, effort made to propagandize on this message. And I don't think this is very healthy.
What about the meeting that took place between Presidents Trump and Zelensky on the sidelines? I mean, a 50-minute long meeting, their first meeting since they met at the funeral of the Pope in Rome. Apparently, things went quite well. I mean, doesn't that offer you some hope that perhaps President Trump has come round at least to the NATO, other NATO member states' view of this war in Ukraine, and indeed the Ukrainian president's view of it?
Well, let's look one more time at reality. Reality is that the United States has halted its cyber operations against Russia. The United States has halted, or rather suspended, any type of military aid packages in support of Ukraine. President Trump has repeatedly said that he has more or less sympathies, understand the Russian rationale of attacking Ukraine. President Trump has formally acknowledged the illegal annexation of Russia, or by Russia, of Crimea. And I can't help but think, he's completely agnostic about the strategic fate of Ukrainians. And I don't expect for a minute that this is going to change in the future, regardless of who he meets and how this meeting eventually comes around. So it is up to us. It is up to the Europeans and all those in the democratic camp who really want to continue work towards making sure that an aggressor such as Russia will not get its way and will not, succeed. And I would have liked to seen at the NATO summit a meeting of the coalition of the willing. Where were they? They keep on making noise for months now about working on a deterrence, a posture, a reinforcement operation in Ukraine in order to really contain Russia in the long run. They were not there. There was no mentioning of that. So I must admit, you probably hear that in my voice. I'm really frustrated to a certain extent and cannot really join the chorus of all those saying it was rose and dandy. It wasn't.
Okay, so you might say to the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, whose language was pretty glowing of the US president, some very interesting choices of words to describe him. But one thing he said, Mr. President, dear Donald, this push for increased alliance defense spending will help you to achieve something that no American president in decades could get done. What you're basically saying is that Mark Rutte is perhaps being unrealistic.
I have spent 23 years of my professional life at NATO. I helped prepare and attended 10 NATO summits, and I worked for 5 NATO Secretary Generals. So I'm extremely well aware that every Secretary General of NATO needs to really strike a positive, constructive tone towards the United States, towards, the American president. But I think there is really space between groveling to the American president and making the points made by other European allies. And I was really embarrassed listening to the Secretary General Mark Rutte praising the leadership of someone in the White House who clearly doesn't really share much of what we, at NATO at least, have tried to come across or get across and cultivate over the years, which is a sense of democratic togetherness and a sense of being treated really as, a community of values. And I can't see this at all. And as I said, I was really embarrassed.
Okay, well, I mean, you're saying that Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, was groveling there essentially to President Trump. But I mean, given the choice between groveling to President Trump and having his involvement and having, some sense of togetherness, and the alternative being annoying President Trump, getting his back up and having him walk away or storm off even, and perhaps turn his back on NATO altogether. I mean, surely the groveling option is the preferable of the two.
Is it really? Is it? Is this really the attitude, the level of ambition that Europeans and Canadians should show? I doubt that very strongly. I wish Europeans would develop a stronger sense of self-confidence and political stamina. I wish very much they would be obviously open and ready to continue working with the United States. You know, I've been a transatlantic for really all my life, so I really wish that we would have a United States on our side on which we can rely on. But I very much doubt that this is the case. So in order to really move forward with the pressing issues here on our continent in Europe, and in order to really support Ukraine, which after 3 years and 4 months still endures, I mean, this absolutely reckless Russian aggression. I really want more, I mean, than European leaders groveling and hoping, I mean, that at some point President Trump will leave the NATO Council room happy. And I don't think this should be really our level of ambition.
So when you hear the Lithuanian president saying that we should choose a motto, which is to make NATO great again, what goes through your mind?
Yeah, I mean, strategic messaging is one. And as we already discussed, it would be really important for the allies, the 32 allies, to come across as dedicated, resolved, and really with, you know, a shared vision of how they want to go about reinvigorate European security. But we don't do this. We talk a lot, we invent new terms like make NATO great again, but at the end of the day, what counts is the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground, that's why I feel so passionate about Ukraine, is that we have failed, we continue to fail to push back a Russian aggressor, which is so reckless and which is killing and terrorizing Ukrainian people all the way in the run-up to this wonderful historic, summit. We really, I think, must become better. And so I really hope for those in the alliance, for those very clear-eyed governments, in particular in Scandinavia, in the Nordic region, in Poland, in the Baltic countries, who understand what is at stake and are really prepared to take the necessary steps.
I mean, under the previous leadership of the alliance, with President Biden at the White House, this war with Ukraine started. Obviously, Ukraine was invaded by Russia, and they didn't manage to stop it. And here we are in the 4th year of this war, as we've been saying in this conversation, and the war still hasn't stopped. Are you at all confident that some fresh approaches, like the ones that President Trump has discussed, and with some unorthodox methods, which we've seen from President Trump, are you at all confident that that could somehow or other yield a result?
No, I'm not. My assumption is that the Russian side will continue executing their summer campaign, all the way in the next few weeks and months, probably by the end of autumn, early winter. Once they come to a halt, they will signal more readiness to start negotiating in one way or the other. And I continue to believe that President Putin feels simply emboldened by our policy. We keep on saying we support Ukraine as long as it takes. We haven't identified any form, any type of strategic end state. If you don't have an end state, if you are, unclear about what is it that you want to achieve, do we want to have a frozen war in the middle of Europe? Is this really what we want collectively and give in to the Russian president? Or do we want to help Ukraine defeat Russia? Unless this question is not answered, we keep on circulating around. And I can only praise the Ukrainian political stamina and resolve, because they continue to make remarkable progress in terms of fighting back developing their own defense industries, their own capabilities, making really smart operational moves on the battlefield, like we've seen just a couple of weeks ago. And so I think Ukrainians they have already become the strategic center of gravity in Europe. So the question should no longer be whether, we support them and, let them wait in front of the NATO doors for the next, 20 years? But I think the question should be rather the other way around, What is it, that Ukrainians can provide and perhaps will be ready to provide in order to secure European security? And yes, that's a question I don't think that has ever occurred to President Trump, nor has he ever voiced it, nor I think is he, someone who thinks in terms of strategic categories. He thinks in terms of quick deals, deliverables, and messages he can sell towards his home base back in the United States.
And just lastly, Dr. Babst, and briefly, if you will, and I'm sure you'll be glad to be brief on this last answer because I don't think you're going to like the question. But the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, likened President Trump to a daddy. That was one of the headlines that came out of the NATO summit, that President Trump is a daddy. Is that an image he conjures up for you?
The organization that I worked for the past 23 years is not a cartel led by, a chief whose ring you need to kiss. I think that says it all.
Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Stefanie Babst, former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you very much for this very good conversation. I appreciate that. All the best to you.
Thank you. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to William Taylor, who is a former US ambassador to Ukraine. Ambassador, you were also US chargé d'affaires to Ukraine under President Trump. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. I expect you saw that on the sidelines of the NATO summit at The Hague, President Trump had about an hour long sit down with President Zelensky. That happened behind closed doors, and it was their first face-to-face meeting since they met at St. Peter's Basilica in April. President Trump said it couldn't have been nicer, and it's been described as a good meeting. I mean, that all sounds pretty positive, doesn't it?
It does indeed. It does indeed. As you say, the Vatican meeting was very positive. There was an earlier meeting in the Oval Office that wasn't very positive. So the last two have been good. And I think it is important for President Trump to hear directly from President Zelensky how he's doing in the war. One of the things that President Trump did say was he's now convinced, if he was ever in doubt, that President Zelensky really does want this war to stop. He doesn't want to, he's not going to surrender, he's not going to capitulate. But President Trump heard President Zelensky loud and clear that he wants this war to stop.
Yeah, there was that very heartwarming exchange between President Trump and that reporter whose husband happens to be a Ukrainian soldier. And just listening to that, I don't know if you saw it, but I mean, what really struck me was it sounds an awful lot like President Trump's approach to Ukraine has changed a bit from that famous meeting at the Oval Office.
I, too, was struck by that interaction. I'm not sure he knew. I'm not sure President Trump knew that this was a Ukrainian reporter. Maybe he did. But he clearly engaged once he heard her say that she was from Ukraine and her husband was in the military and she was living in Warsaw with her two kids while this war, and he engaged. I agree. This was an indication of a much more positive attitude towards Ukraine and Ukraine's people.
Yeah, I don't know what's brought about this change. President Trump was asked, of course, in that exchange with the reporter, whether the United States might entertain the idea of sending more US-made Patriot air defense missile systems. I mean, do you think that's likely to happen?
I do. I think that was also a topic in the conversation that President Zelensky had with President Trump earlier. This has been a constant refrain, constant request, constant identification of a big problem. It's the Russians bombarding with drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. Ukrainians, not just on the front line, not just soldiers, not just military targets, but civilian targets, cities. And so President Zelensky and all Ukrainians know that they depend on the United States for those very sophisticated Patriot weapons, Patriot missiles that can knock down those ballistic missiles. It's the only weapon that can. And Ukrainians know that. Ukrainians are now experts on all kinds, both the Russian military and the American, U.S. military. So this is a high priority for all Ukrainians.
I mean, in terms of the relationship between those two men, President Zelensky, President Trump, I mean, we've seen it go up and down, and we've talked about the highs and the lows. Apart from that sort of perception of the relationship, has Ukraine received markedly less support, would you say, and I'm talking about material support, under President Trump than it was getting under President Biden?
Not yet. Not yet. One of the things we can say is the new administration has not stopped the flow of weapons that have been, as you say, coming from the United States for 3 years. That flow continues. It has not been stopped. It was stopped briefly, as you recall, after that discussion in the Oval Office. But it's been steady. It hasn't increased, but hasn't yet decreased. However, it will run out. That pipeline will go dry in a matter of months. And so a real question is, how do the Ukrainians purchase or otherwise acquire American weapons? And I'm sure that was a topic of conversation as well.
What's your understanding of what the situation's like on the ground in Ukraine? Because in the summer months, obviously in the winter, not a lot happens because it's so cold and the battle is more or less frozen along the lines that it left off on in the autumn. But now we're sort of well into the summer. What's the latest you're hearing? What are your sources telling you about who's achieving what on the battlefield?
The Russians are achieving small gains, is what I hear. I hear this from my friends in the Ukrainian army. I hear from intelligence sources and the media. I mean, you've probably reported this as well, Tom. That is, the Russians are making small gains at enormous cost in terms of the number of Russian soldiers killed for those small gains. I mean, I'm sure you've been reporting on Pokrovsk, which the Russians have been trying to take. This is not a big city. This is a small city. It was a small city. It's now deserted. But the Russians have been trying to take Pokrovsk for a year with limited success. I mean, they're grinding in that direction. They still haven't taken it. So at great cost, enormous cost to the Russian military, they are making grinding progress. However, when you take a look at the overall picture, when you look at the map of Ukraine and you identify the part of Ukraine that is occupied by the Russians, it's about 19%, about 19.5% of all of Ukraine's territory is occupied by the Russians. And 2 years ago, it was the same, Tom. The Russians have not made big gains. They have not made, certainly not any breakthroughs. The amount of territory occupied, it has been the same for 2 years, the last 2 years. And so, yes, this grinding movement of the Russian forces at enormous cost is taking place this summer. It's accelerated a little bit over the past, in the spring and early summer. But the Ukrainians have been holding off. I keep track. The Ukrainians have been holding off the Russians for 1,219 days, and they continue to hold them off.
Yeah, I mean, it's an impressive number. Now, I think you're sounding as though you're likely to agree with what President Trump's been saying, because he has been expressing this belief that President Putin wants to end the war in Ukraine. I can quote President Trump as saying he'd like to get out of this thing. It's a mess for him. I mean, do you think that's right? President Putin is sort of, perhaps, is he sending signals to Washington that he really wants this war to come to an end?
I doubt it. I don't know what Putin is saying to President Trump.
Where's President Trump getting this idea from?
President Trump wants to believe that Putin wants to get out of this war. And I imagine Putin has played on that in his conversations with Trump. But President Putin gives no indication, zero indication, in any other forum, in any other way, that he wants to end this war. He wants to continue this war. He wants to continue to try to control Ukraine. As you know, as you've reported, Putin thinks that there is no such thing as Ukraine. He doesn't think Ukraine really exists, and he just wants to take it back into Russia. So irrespective of what Putin is telling Trump, Putin does not want to end this war. Zelensky does, Trump does, Putin does not.
Right, and that was a source of huge frustration for President Trump because he campaigned on that pledge to bring about a swift conclusion to this war. It's not happening, and he must be, exasperated by that, isn't he?
I think he is. I think he's starting to show it, and I think he's starting to recognize where the problem is. The problem is Putin. He's starting to recognize that. He's expressing frustration just in the past day there in The Hague. He says, I'm going to have to call Putin. He says, Zelensky wants this war to end. I'm convinced of that. He's got a tough job, Zelensky. But it's Vladimir Putin that is holding this up, and Trump says he's going to call him again to try to get him to move to a ceasefire. He's tried before. Trump has tried before to get Putin to agree to a ceasefire, and Putin basically said no to Trump 3 months ago. So Trump is learning, is understanding, is realizing that Putin is the problem, and he's going to have to put some pressure on Putin to bring him to the table.
One thing that might help him, and we're talking about President Trump, get President Putin to the table. The latest stats out of Russia regarding the health of the Russian economy, not looking too good. What's remarkable, and this is really for the benefit of our viewers, I'm sure you know this, is that the Russian economy managed to grow some 4.5% last year. In the first quarter of this year, it's been more like 1.4%. So they've ridden out 3 years, and yet now things are starting to look a bit tighter. It does look like, there's a banking crisis. Look like there's a debt crisis. Interest rates are around 20%. Could that have an effect on the Russian president's approach to this war, do you think? I mean, the tightening of the screws economically.
It absolutely could. It absolutely could. The only way the Russian economy is doing well is on the military side. Putin has channeled incredible resources from the civilian side of his economy, of the Russian economy, to the military side. So that growth is not from consumers. It's not from investment. It's from military production. It's from the Russians trying to maintain their war machine and paying soldiers incredible amounts of money to get them to volunteer and go to be killed in Ukraine. That's what's driving the Russian economy right now. The civilian side, as you've indicated, as those stats are now showing, is really suffering. And it does have an effect. It can have an effect. If President Trump puts pressure, economic pressure, on Putin to bring him to let Putin understand, to bring Putin to the conclusion that he can't win and that his economy is cratering on the civilian side, Trump can make that clear in terms of sanctions. Tom, you probably reported there's a bill in the United States Senate that's supported by 82 of the 100 senators. So this is broad bipartisan support to put really severe, harsh sanctions on Russian oil, very severe, hard sanctions. So that's a strong support for Ukraine and strong recognition that Putin is the problem.
Yeah, just so that, as well, people don't think this is wishful thinking on the part of Western commentators, but at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum last week, the Russian economy minister, Maxim Reshetnikov, said, we are on the verge of slipping into recession. So there seems to be this recognition in Russia that things aren't going well economically speaking. The Europeans are mulling fresh restrictions on Russian banks. If the US were to follow suit, that would be really a case of falling on a bruise for the Russian economy, wouldn't it?
It would indeed. It would indeed. The combination of European action on their latest sanctions proposal and the United States supporting that, again, with more sanctions as the Europeans are doing on the Russian banks that are still operating. They're still operating within the international system. There are banks that are not yet sanctioned that should be, and those should be. And then again, cracking down on the sale of Russian oil through this sanctions bill that is in the Senate or otherwise, right, reducing the price cap from $60 to say $40 a barrel. That kind of squeeze, turning the screws, as you say, could really have an effect now more than in previous times.
Ambassador, turning our attention back to what happened at The Hague earlier on this week, we've had NATO member states, well, almost all of them, agreeing to spend collectively 5% of GDP on defense during the next decade. What message does that send Moscow, do you think?
Strong message. That Putin, who wanted to weaken NATO, he wanted to divide NATO, has had the opposite. He has achieved the opposite. He has unified NATO. He has strengthened NATO. He's expanded NATO with the Finns and the Swedes. And now the NATO allies are going to spend 5% of their GDP on defense, both on the hard side and on the soft side of defense. And that's making NATO stronger. That's a message to Putin that he needs to stop this war. He needs to come to the table, agree on a ceasefire, pull his troops back. His economy's in bad shape. NATO is stronger. He's isolated. He's got the Belarusians and the Chinese and North Koreans, but that's about it. So now's the time for Putin to come to the conclusion that he can't win and cut his losses.
Yeah, and of course, Russia spends quite a bit more on defense than that 5% figure. It's somewhere between the 6 and 7% of GDP mark, accounting for about 40% of total annual budget. I just want to pick up on what's happened in Iran this week. And obviously, President Trump played a key part in bringing that 12-day war to a swift conclusion. Does that play into this, do you think? Do you think President Trump has shown Russia that when he weighs in, he actually can bring a war to an end? I mean, I just wonder if you can see any connection or any momentum that might come out of the conclusion of the 12-day war and that being translated to some sort of a conclusion to this war in Ukraine.
I think so, Tom. I think so. Two things occur to me. One is, here's another ally, Iran, another ally of Russia, gone down, being defeated, pulled back. And the Iranians were probably hoping for some support from the Russians, and they got none. They got no support from the Russians. And the Iranians are going to have a hard time continuing to provide the weapons that they've been providing to the Russians. That's number one. But you're right about the other message. President Trump has shown that when you stonewall him, when you play him, as the Iranians did, trying to say that they were going to negotiate in order to stop their nuclear weapons program, they were stonewalling. They were playing along. Mr. Witkoff, Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy to Iran, they weren't serious about this. And when President Trump realized that, when he recognized that the Iranians were not serious about a negotiated solution, he took action. And on the Russian side, the Russians are clearly playing him along. Putin is, as we talked about earlier, Tom, Putin is playing Trump. And Trump, as you say, is starting to recognize that, starting to realize that Putin is the problem. And like he did with the Iranians, Trump can turn on the Russians and he can turn on Putin. And if he puts the pressure on Putin by the economic measures that we just talked about, as well as providing the weapons that we just talked about, that could have a real effect.
Just to wrap up this conversation, Ambassador, I mean, Ukraine wasn't formally involved at that NATO summit at The Hague in the same way that Ukraine was involved at other NATO summits in the past. However, as we've said, there was this constructive dialogue, 50 minutes of conversation face-to-face between President Zelensky and President Trump. Just to sum up for us, how reassured do you think Ukraine will be feeling at the end of what's been an eventful week?
I think somewhat reassured. As you say, the conversation between the two presidents was good. The comments about the meeting from President Trump were positive. The comments about the meeting from President Zelensky were positive. So that's good. The possibility of Patriot missiles coming to help the Ukrainians defend themselves against Russian missiles. That's being on the table, being highlighted, getting a supportive statement from President Trump. That's good as well. The Secretary General of NATO went out of his way to say that Ukraine is still on an irreversible path to NATO membership. Yeah, that's not in the declaration, that's not in the communique, but the Secretary General made it very explicit that has not changed. That's a policy that NATO has had really since 2008, but more specific for last year on a reversible path. And so I think the Ukrainians are reassured by those statements.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. We really appreciate your time. William Taylor, former US ambassador to Ukraine, thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
Meanwhile, in the United States, debate continues with regards to the impact of last weekend's strikes on Iran's nuclear sites. Well, a leaked classified assessment suggests that the damage may have been less severe than was initially claimed, possibly only resulting in a setback of a few months to Iran's nuclear program. But that assessment contrasts with statements from senior US officials, with the CIA Director John Ratcliffe saying that the facilities would need to be rebuilt over the course of years. And the Pentagon chief, Pete Hegseth, has accused the media of misrepresenting the operation.
President Trump directed the most complex and secretive military operation in history. And it was a resounding success, resulting in a ceasefire agreement and the end of the 12-day war. There's been a lot of discussion about what happened and what didn't happen. Step back for a second. Because of decisive military action, President Trump created the conditions to end the war, decimating, choose your word, obliterating, destroying Iran's nuclear capabilities. I want to read some of the assessments that have been provided, because whether it's fake news, CNN, MSNBC, or the New York Times, there's been fawning coverage of a preliminary assessment. I haven't had a chance to read it. Every outlet has breathlessly reported on a preliminary assessment from DIA. I'm looking at it right now. Again, it was preliminary, a day and a half after the actual strike, when it admits itself in writing that it requires weeks to accumulate the necessary data to make such an assessment. It's preliminary.
The US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth there. Meanwhile, Iran's supreme leader has accused President Trump of exaggerating the impact of those US strikes on Iranian nuclear sites. Here's what he said.
We thank God for helping our armed forces to be able to penetrate their advanced multi-layered defenses and to put many of their urban and military areas under pressure with our missiles, and to flatten them with a strong attack using our advanced weapons. They attacked our nuclear facilities, which is, of course, subject to independent prosecution in international courts, but they were not able to achieve anything significant.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Matt Spence, who is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Middle East policies under President Obama. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, sir. We've been following developments in Iran very closely here at Arabiya English all week. A highly unpredictable 12-day war, and events seem to come to a fairly hasty conclusion. Are you confident we're now going to see a lasting peace?
I think it's very early innings, and what we know now is not necessarily what's going to happen. I think what we need to understand are two big things. First, Iran has been seeking to build a nuclear program, have conventional weapons, have non-conventional weapons to attack the United States and others for quite some time. Those are not eliminated overnight, and we need to be very careful about what the damage assessment is. And then the second piece is Iran has spent an enormous amount of time making sure that their nuclear program is buried, very difficult to attack. It was a critical issue to make sure to take these out, but it is far too early for us to know exactly what has happened. The key question for us right now, Michael, is to understand how much damage was done, how lasting is that damage, and what else needs to be done to stop Iran from having a nuclear program.
You say that, and yet the Trump administration sounds extremely confident about how much damage has been done. I mean, President Trump said the Iranian nuclear program has been, quote, obliterated. We heard from Pete Hegseth a little earlier on saying that the media is simply trying to downplay what was achieved there. I mean, there's a bit of confusion there, isn't there?
I mean, look, I think the most important thing to understand is that all of us who are looking to have a stable Middle East and a stable situation wants to see Iran's nuclear program decimated, irreparably so, and for a large amount of time. Now, the other thing we often realize is in any fog of war, in any military operation, the first intelligence operations and the first intelligence set that we get back is often wrong. So I think what we need to do now is find the best intelligence in an apolitical way to make sure we understand exactly what happened. And we all want to make sure that Iran's program is decimated as much as we can. Right now, I think it's too early to tell.
In terms of what we're hearing from Tehran, we heard some pretty defiant, pretty uncooperative language coming from the supreme leader who said the Islamic Republic emerged victorious and delivered a harsh slap to America's face. This he said in a pre-recorded message. He added that the US had gained no achievements from this war. I mean, that all sounds like a bit of a red flag to President Trump, doesn't it?
I think I take what the supreme leader says about a damage assessment about his illegal nuclear program that he has created in violation of UN Security Council resolutions and violation with the IAEA and other international organizations have found. I take what the supreme leader has said really with a grain of salt. I think the key question to understand is first, why is Iran seeking to continue an illegal nuclear program that is denied publicly from having? And then second, what has actually been done to set that back? Right now, what we should be focused on is what has been done to set back this illegal nuclear program and what more needs to be done to make sure that Iran does not pose a threat to the United States and its allies in the region.
A week ago, there were people talking to us on this channel using the expression regime change quite frequently, in fact. Not hearing quite so much of it this week, but the Supreme Leader's been in hiding for quite a lot of the best part of a week. I'm wondering whether you think he comes out of hiding a more vulnerable leader than when he went into hiding.
I mean, if I was the Supreme Leader, I would certainly not move out of hiding. That sounds like an extraordinarily risky move and something that I would not encourage him to do. I think the bigger question right now is, what are the capabilities that have been degraded or limited, which would allow Iran to pose a threat to the United States and America's allies in the region? What I would like to say, it's been heavily decimated. What is incredibly important to remember is that we keep very focused on our military goals. Iran is a military and nuclear threat in the region. What we are seeking to do is eliminate their ability to use nuclear weapons or develop nuclear weapons to threaten the region and to use other forms of military means. That's what we need to be laser focused on right now, stopping Iran's illegal attempts to gain prominence and a nuclear power in the region.
Again, just looking at Israel's attitude to all of this, a 12-day war, a number of successes on the battlefield, I think it's fair to say, multiple intelligence coups that they've had really for the last 12 months. Do you think they wanted to stop the fight on Monday when President Trump imposed the ceasefire, or do you think they thought there was still a lot more to be done?
My experience, based on talking to a number of military leaders from Israel well over a decade, is they wanted to go forward. That Israel wanted to use whatever military capabilities they had to take as much that they could right now. If it were ordered to stop, they would listen because they face an enormous amount of pressure from the United States and other pieces. But I'm imagining the United States wanted to do, I wanted to imagine that Israel did whatever they could do to degrade Iran's nuclear capabilities and conventional military capabilities right now. I think the next few days will be critical to understand how much has been degraded, and if there are capabilities left, what will the United States do? And what will Israel do? This is a very open question right now.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time, Matt Spence. A pleasure talking to you.
Thanks so much. Enjoyed my time with you.
As always, on a Thursday, we take a look back on the week in US politics, and a lot has been dominated in the headlines by the US airstrikes on Iran and then the subsequent ceasefire. And of course, we've been talking in this program about the NATO conference as well, at which the US president was present. So lots to talk about with our guest today, who is Amanda Mackey, a Republican strategist and lawyer who joins us from Florida. Amanda, great to have you with us. Let's start by talking about Iran. I mean, what a lot has changed since we spoke a week ago. I mean, are you astonished, I'm sure you are, at the pace of change, the pace of developments with regards to Iran?
I am and I'm not, because I think that President Trump really wanted to move very quickly and swiftly. I also think Israel had a lot to do with it. It was very influential in getting the United States to do this jointly. And so I think things moved at a very rapid pace, though we were all a little bit surprised. I think this might have been planned for a very long time, maybe since the president even took office, they have been planning for this.
Right, so we had since we spoke a week ago, we had the US strike at the weekend on those nuclear facilities in Iran, 3 separate facilities. We had the Iranian response on Monday, which was to attack a US military base in Qatar. And then we had pretty quickly thereafter the declaration of a ceasefire brokered by President Trump. I mean, all very quick. A lot of the debate in the US still seems to be about just how damaging those strikes were on the Iranian nuclear facilities. I mean, what's your take on all of this?
Well, they keep going back and forth. And this morning, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, held a very stern press conference and called out even the likes of Fox News, that typically most Americans would say leans on the side of conservative, and called him out on really not reflecting the news properly and not reporting the news properly, and also saying that you guys want to see the president fail, and that's why you report it. And so it was a very heated exchange. And I think that's because CNN kind of started this, and then they just kept talking about how, well, it really wasn't hit. And if you see on social media, a lot of the liberal comments are more focused on this didn't really do anything and the setback was very minimal. I think now you're seeing all the heads of the agencies that are relevant here, Department of Defense, intelligence and security, all come out and say, no, this was a strike. It was a real strike, and it did affect them in a very big way, in a very major way. And so while we can't anticipate how many months they have or how many years they have that they can come back and re-enrich, I think the bottom line is that we got Iran to be on its knees, and Iran is in a place where it cannot continue to at least attack or be in a place where it can't come to the table to negotiate as the United States and President Trump wanted it to.
Yeah, and just for the benefit of our viewers who might not have seen our conversation last week, but you are of Iranian heritage yourself, so I'm assuming you've been watching this very, very closely, these developments. And what struck me the last day or two is really Iran sounding defiant. And we heard the supreme leader saying that a harsh slap has been delivered to America's face. I mean, I don't know what you read into that. He's not sounding at all cooperative with Washington. Is he looking vulnerable, would you say?
Well, this is a regime that, manipulates their people. This is a dictatorial regime that brainwashes its people, and all of their media is state-sponsored. So if he says that, you echo it, other anchors echo it, but in Iran, they will yell this from the top of the hills, and it will be on every broadcast because it is all state-sponsored news. And so, of course, he has to say that. What is he going to say? We failed, we lost? That's in essence what happened, but they'll never admit that. And that's why you saw on Monday, when they did attack the American base, they let the United States know, just like they did when Qasem Soleimani in 2020 was assassinated. Same thing, their retaliation, they made it known. Iran made it known. So Iran is not in a position where it is at the level of the United States, that it can go toe-to-toe with the United States, but it has to, kind of like the small dog's bark is worse than its bite. And that's really what you're seeing right now is the Ayatollah. We haven't heard from him in days. We heard from him, recently as of today. But he's been communicating through someone that's trusted. He doesn't have any kind of electronic messaging availability. So he basically is scared. He's on his knees and he's doing the best that he can to continue to show the Iranian people that he still has power. But everyone knows that he is growing impotent by the day.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, just before we move on to talking about the NATO summit, just to wrap up on Iran and drawing on your expertise on Iran and what your contacts and your connections are telling you. But some analysts were saying, as you've been saying, that the Supreme Leader has somehow been in hiding these last few days. He's been very quiet. No one's seen or heard very much of him until today he gave that recorded address. Some analysts saying he's going to emerge from hiding and find a very different Iran from the Iran he knew when he went into hiding. What do you think they mean by that?
I think that the Iranian people feel a lot more powerful now. They feel like they have the backing of the United States, even though it may only be symbolic. That they went against the regime. The United States went against the regime. They actually did something because no president before President Trump was willing to engage in any meaningful way on behalf of the Iranian people. President Obama may have had the best opportunity back in 2010 during the Green Uprising. He never did anything. So the Iranian people have largely been left to do it on their own. And we all know how the Iranian people are treated if they try to revolt against this administration, against this regime. They will be thrown to Evin prison, one of the worst, most notoriously heinous prisons in the world. They will have, repercussions that can be fatal, as we saw with Mahsa Amini, who dared to take her veil off, her hijab off, and look what happened to her: brain damage, and she ultimately died. So this is a regime that the Iranian people are afraid of, but now they feel more powerful now that the United States and Israel are involved.
Okay, Amanda, let's move on. President Trump is back from a fairly quick trip to Europe. Some saying a very productive trip to Europe. He attended the NATO summit. Others a little bit more skeptical, saying it was good on comms, maybe not so good on substance as a summit. Don't know what you make of that. But one of the words that's come out of this, one of the unlikely words to come out of a headline relating to a NATO summit is the word daddy, a word that was used by the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte to describe the US President Donald Trump. And it seems like he likes this word because the White House X feed has today said daddy's home. What do you think people there in America think of this idea of President Trump being daddy all of a sudden?
Well, I don't think that is actually the true meaning of it. It was taken out of context. What Mark Rutte was trying to say is that, these two countries have been at it for 4 decades, just as President Trump said when he left at the White House lawn. And basically what he was trying to convey was that, you kind of have to be the mediator here. I think there was a lot lost in translation because the American way of defining that sounds very different in our slang terms here. So I think it was meant to be different. I think the president, the White House, and the social media folks are just trying to now just put some light on it, shed some light on what was said in a maybe comical way. But the bottom line is that President Trump was intervening between these two countries, and he was very upset when he left for the summit. He was very upset on the White House lawn that day, even using an expletive, which I'd never heard him say before, especially in this type of context. So he was very frustrated, both with Israel and with Iran, but as he said, more with Israel for what happened. He just wants a ceasefire. That's what he's trying to achieve. And he wants these two countries to stop fighting, like you want two children to stop fighting.
Right, yeah. So Mark Rutte was talking about this schoolyard brawl that he likened it to, the tensions between Iran and Israel, and President Trump weighing in and sort of, knocking some sense into the two sides and bringing about a resolution. But I mean, clearly they're enjoying it at the White House, saying daddy's home. I mean, that's not me misquoting the president or the language being used around him. That's the White House's X feed. But very unusual, very surprising. President Trump clearly, as you say, left for Europe in a filthy mood. I mean, he looked really and sounded, as you said, extremely annoyed as he set off. And he came back extremely different, almost a different person. I mean, that's unusual, isn't it, coming back from a NATO summit for President Trump?
Well, I think he won. I mean, it was very, very obvious to me and to everyone else watching that, the NATO countries were not going to do what President Trump wanted, which he had been requesting and talking about since he was president last time, 2016 and 2017, I'm sorry, when he was talking about this very same thing, saying, you guys have to pay your fair share. We can't be the whipping boy for the rest of the world. We can't be the ones that have to keep paying and paying at such a larger share than you guys. And so the defense spending went up to 5%. And that was for a vast majority of the countries. And that's why I think President Trump was happy, looked at this as a success and as a win. And certainly the UN general had a lot to say about that, too, in praising President Trump. So I think he looked at it as a victorious lap, if you will, that he was able to take. And something that he really hadn't experienced before with the UN, where they'd been very anti-President Trump. And I think now, with everything that President Trump's done, and even what happened last Saturday in Iran, I think people are a little bit more fearful of this president of the United States and not wanting to be in the crosshairs of him and this country and what the possibilities are. So they're coming to the table. They're stepping up as he wanted back in 2017.
Right. So just to wrap up, I mean, you're painting the picture that President Trump has really had these twin vindications. He got what he wanted, and he was right about asking for NATO member states to step up their expenditure, something he first asked them to do in 2017. He's now got their commitment. And the other vindication is that strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, which was politically risky. There were people in the Republican Party who told him not to, but he went ahead and did it. And basically, it sounds to me as though you think he's come out of this stronger.
Absolutely, I do. And if you look at the polling in the United States of where Republicans, Democrats, and independents are, you'll see that over 60% of Americans of all political stripes want to see more involvement with the U.S. In Iran, and in particular, maybe not boots on the ground, but to make sure they don't have weapons capabilities and they are not nuclearizing their program. So that is something that Americans, by and large, want to see. And I think he will receive high marks when more polling is done on not only the effort, but the outcome. And so when you see this spin of the media, the liberal media, going after him and saying, he didn't really do anything, not only is it an affront to the president, which of course the president expects, but it's an affront to the service members who engaged in this and were successful in this. And coming back instead a hero, you have CNN and the like saying, they didn't really do anything, when in fact they did. I think President Trump's going to receive a lot of high marks, not only for NATO, but also, as you said, for what happened in Iran last Saturday.
And what about
out their nuclear program?
Just last, what about the people who told him not to intervene in Iran, the Marjorie Taylor Greens? Have they conversely come out of this looking a little bit weaker, perhaps?
I don't think so. I think their big focus is no more of our men and women, no more of our boots on the ground. And right now, that's not at all even being discussed. A lot of people are talking about regime change, and they'll ask me, well, what do you think is going to happen? I don't believe that the United States or members of Congress on the Republican side have any interest in engaging in regime change. Now, Israel might, but I don't know that the United States has any interest in that right now. That could change 3 to 6 months from now, but that's not where we're at. So a targeted strike, as what happened on Saturday, in and out with no casualties on our side, I think that's what GOP members will support. They just don't want to see our men and women have to suffer for a war that's not our war to fight.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. We're out of time. Amanda Mackie, Republican strategist, thank you very much. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Well, that is all we have time for on today's edition of GNT. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for a look back at some of the highlights of the week. Until then, bye-bye.